Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Q&A about history of science and technology. Let me see, I have a number of questions saved up here. This question from Nick. Would I have been surprised by the discovery of North and South America back in the day, or is that something that would have been supported by science? I think it's an interesting story. My impression of the story is people kind of say, oh, everybody thought the Earth was flat until, Columbus and so on. That's just not true. That's sort of a myth of history of science. People like Eratosthenes in antiquity were perfectly well aware of the fact that the Earth was round, was spherical, and in fact had gotten a pretty good estimate for the radius of the Earth. It was well known by people like Archimedes and so on what the rough radius of the Earth was. What ended up happening was people knew about Europe, they knew about the Orient, because Marco Polo had gone that way around, gone over land to the Orient from Italy, and things like that. And then the question was, well, was there an ocean route across, I guess it was called the Ocean Sea, to get to the Orient? Well, Columbus had, from what I gather, a wrong model of the world. He had a different value for the radius of the Earth. And so he was like, yeah, I can make it in, 6 weeks or something across from Europe to the Orient. And that'll be okay because nobody will starve in that time and nobody will get scurvy or whatever else would happen if you were off on a ship in the ocean for too long a time. So he got his funding to go do that with a piece of essentially bad science. Well, it turns out he was really lucky because if it had really been, if there wasn't any American continent and he'd have to go across the Atlantic and the Pacific, then in those days, the folks on his ships would not have survived that amount of time. But in fact, he was lucky because it turns out there was a whole continent in the middle. Now, was there any way one could have known that there was a whole continent there without having visited it? At the time, I just don't think so. I think, I think that would be very hard to know. Is there some measurement one could have made about gravity or something like that? I don't think so. And obviously, this was all happening in the late 1400s, nearly 200 years before things like Newton and universal gravitation and things like that were going on. So I think it was one of those cases where you just had to go there and see. And the people might have never tried it if it hadn't been for a sort of a piece of wrong science that said it should be possible. And hence, all kinds of all kinds of funky names for the East Indies and things like this. The For things where it wasn't clear where they had got to because they could only see one side of the continent and so on. Anyway, a few thoughts on that. Let's see. There's a question from Uriah here. How would you think about, are we alone in the universe? How has this been addressed in history? Well, I mean, my own view of this, which maybe I shouldn't go into in too much depth in this particular live stream, has to do with the question of sort of what counts as intelligence? Does the weather have a mind of its own? Well, I think it does in some computational sense, but its mind is not well aligned with human minds. And I think there's intelligence all over the universe. The question is just, is it sort of human-like intelligence that we would recognize as something that we can communicate with and so on? And that I think is much sparser, just like it's a long way from here to the nearest stars other than the sun. So it's a long way in what I call rulal space from where minds like ours are to where alien minds might be. Now, if you ask about the history of people thinking about other worlds, it's That is something that I know, well, for example, Giordano Bruno, I think in, gosh, when was that? Uh, Somewhere in the Middle Ages was talking about this, and nobody liked it very much. And the church of the time was pretty against any sort of anything detracting from the primacy of humans as kind of the favored critters in the universe type thing. And I think that was it was sort of a little bit of a religious heresy to imagine that there were civilizations associated with other stars and so on. By the time people like Kepler were talking about the moon and making observations about the moon, I think Kepler kind of just assumed there'd be people living on the moon because what had been found with the Earth was you go to all different corners of the Earth. You go to the Americas, you go to Australia, you go wherever, and there are people there. So it's like you see the moon, and insofar as the moon is sort of an Earth-like place, yeah, there'll be people there. And I think it was Kepler who talked about sort of the lunar inhabitants will be kind of in shadow for this amount of time, and because of the long length of the lunar day and such like. And they'll be having a whole discussion about sort of the folks living on the moon. And I think in this is a thing where I would say that there was sort of an assumption of life elsewhere until probably the 1970s. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, people were talking about Mars having these sort of changes of color and from, reddish to more greenish. And that was like vegetation coming in at different seasons on Mars. Turns out it's actually dust storms. But when the first Mars landers landed in what, 1976 or so, it was, people were kind of really expecting, well, at least there'll be microbes there. There weren't. And I think that was, and people sort of adapted to that fairly quickly. But the idea that there will be sort of lifelike stuff, human-like intelligence elsewhere, has been something that's been sort of widely assumed for a long time. And it's only been in the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years that the notion that we might be sort of the only entities of our exact kind in the universe has come home, so to speak. I mean, I remember when the Apollo astronauts were coming back to Earth in 1969 and so on, there was it was like we better quarantine them. They might have caught moon bugs, and they were off quarantine for 10 days or something, so that the moon bugs would all have died, so as not to kind of start a scenario like the War of the Worlds scenario, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds scenario for humans from bugs from elsewhere type thing. I mean, it's also worth remembering in what the 1940s when the War of the Worlds radio program, people thought that this fictionalized attack of the Martians was real, and it was like, yeah, there are going to be Martians. It's worth remembering also in the early part of the 20th century, famously Nikola Tesla, who was kind of hearing these radio emissions from the cosmos, so to speak, assumed that these were the Martians communicating with us. Actually, they were features of the ionosphere, modes of the ionosphere that were being picked up by radio. But so, there was sort of an assumption of these things until things like the Mars landers said, well, actually, there's no life that we can detect here on Mars right now. I think, as I say, my own view is that the issue is there's plenty of intelligence, and even, well, I don't know how one defines life, out there in the universe. It's just not like ours. And this question of how far away can it be so that we can still align with it is a non-trivial question. It's a question that's being cast into clearer perspective with AIs and so on, which are our sort of local human-generated alien intelligence, so to speak. Let's see. There's a question here from Des. How would you think about speculating on the history of hitchhiking, going back to ancient Rome or even the earliest cities? I would assume that it would be things like ox-drawn carts, not expensive horses. I I don't know. I would sort of this whole question about when do you trust people, when do you not, seems to have gone up and down in history. I mean, it's kind of in many countries now we live in a time when all these kind of ride share and this and that and the other sort of one might have thought at previous times that could never work. You could never trust people enough to do that. Just as you might have thought, at other times in history, it's like, oh yeah, you don't have to lock your door. Anybody who just sort of wanders by, you'll invite them in. It seems like this question of sort of trust of strangers has gone up and down over time, and maybe it's something where you kind of have to know where you are to know whether you should trust the strangers, so to speak. And so I would guess that I I don't know. In different times in history, in different places, the sort of do you trust to pick up the hitchhiker, or is the hitchhiker going to kill you and steal your stuff? Is has probably changed, and there must have been there were plenty of sort of highway bandits back in the day, certainly in antiquity, and beyond. It doesn't seem like that's such a big thing these days in most countries. So it's seems to have gone up and down. I think it's the other question is, well, at different times in history, when there was sort of a strong, the Roman Empire was kind of laying down the law everywhere versus it was just kind of every village for itself. I'm sure the dynamics of this were a bit different. And there were times when it was kind of like there was an expected kind of larger scale kind of civil behavior type expectation versus, well, in my village, this or that will happen, and everybody knows each other. If you go to the next door village, who knows what will happen to you or to other people? A few thoughts about that, at least. Um, let's see. There's a question here from Takasha Takashi. Um, what do you know about colors and how we represent them in computing? Well, the whole story of what colors are is is one that I guess in terms of practitioners goes back a long time in terms of people mixing paint and noticing, red, yellow, blue, you can kind of mix them together, really cyan, magenta, yellow. You can mix them together and get other colors of paint. I think that's been known for a really long time. In terms of mixing light and the realization that white light is made up of all the different colors of light, certainly Isaac Newton was aware of that. And as soon as you have prisms where you're bending light and it bends the red and the blue light bend the different amounts, you kind of get to see the spectrum of the sun makes a spectrum, a fire makes a spectrum, and so on. And you can kind of get the idea white light is made of different colors of light put together. There was a lot of work done, I would say, really accelerating in the 1800s about understanding how we humans perceive color. And I think Thomas Young was the person who had originally the kind of three primary color theory of human vision. That must have been in the early 1800s. I think he was also the person who decoded Egyptian hieroglyphics, if I remember correctly. But then kind of by the mid 1800s, there was sort of quite a lot of theory of how colors were made. So, for example, James Clerk Maxwell, most famous for his Maxwell equations for electrodynamics, was he did a whole bunch on kind of the geometry of color space. Famously, he used his wife's blue eye color as sort of his fiducial color to represent things. I think Helmholtz did a bunch of work on color vision. The As I say, this is kind of 1850s, 1860s, sort of really a nailing down of representing colors in terms of these sort of three variables of sort of red, green, blue primary colors for light. Then I think coming into the 1900s, there started to be sort of a desire to standardize colors in various ways, both on the printing side and on the light side. On the light side, there's this CIE chromaticity diagram, I think that's from 1933, that is sort of a way of having sort of a standardization of how colors are set up. Now, one of the questions is in sort of this color space, how do you represent a color in color space? Is it this amount of red, this amount of green, this amount of blue? That's one color model. If you look in Wolfram language, for example, you'll find a bunch of different color models. The famous ones are the RGB color space, the XYZ color space, the LAB color space, hue, saturation, brightness, etc. So, for example, the XYZ color space was an attempt, this was in the 1930s, I think, to represent the actual excitation of the three kinds of color receptors in our eyes. So that the X, Y, and Z coordinates were really representing kind of the amount of excitation, essentially the electric currents generated by the red, green, and blue cone cells in our retinas. And the reason that's relevant is if you want to find out sort of what's the distance between two colors, it's worth knowing that sort of in the coordinate system in which we're perceiving them. And why is that important? Well, it's like you've got these two colors out here in the blue area of the color triangle. You've got these two colors here in the red area. And you ask the question, what distance in color space can you go and have people still not be able to distinguish the color? How far do you have to go before people say those are different colors? And so in XYZ color space, it's sort of a uniform thing. In RGB color space, it's different in different parts of the space. I think in the 1930s, there was a lot done in sort of color matching and theories of color and what colors go with other colors and so on. There was also a desire to standardize colors for things like textiles and so on. And what color is that? And there were various color systems. The Munsell color system, I'm not sure exactly when. I think that might be from slightly later, like 1950s. And then things like the Pantone color system, where you actually have these color chips and little swatches of color printed that are the things you use to compare. Yes, this really is the right color that's being printed here. Another thing that came in was four-color printing, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, making those little dots, little rosettes that you can see under a magnifying glass in color printed magazines and so on. That, by the time color printing was a thing, which I'm guessing was the 1920s, 1930s, it must have been the result of lithography, being able to have that, because previous printing of pictures had tended to be these woodcuts and things or just black and white with dithering stipple patterns and so on. I think as soon as there was four-color printing, where you would have sort of separate runs through the press, so to speak, with the cyan, the yellow, magenta, etc., kind of colors being put in, then there had to be a much better understanding of kind of color spaces and where. And when somebody ran the press and they put a certain amount of cyan, a certain amount of yellow, and so on, and then somebody looked at the results and does that match Pantone color number such and such? That was a thing certainly by the 1950s. That was a very routine thing to be doing. So I think in terms of computers, the earliest kind of approach was using color maps. And when we were building first version of Mathematica back in 1986, 1987, it was still the case that most color on computers was representing using color maps. What did that mean? It meant there was some intrinsic collection of colors that could be represented using, for example, 8 bits per 256 possible values for red, green, and blue, and so on. But you weren't actually specifying every color specifically in terms of those 3 numbers. Instead, what you were doing is you were setting up a color map where you would say, okay, I'm going to have 100 colors I'm going to use in this picture or on this screen, and each one of those I'm going to put into this index with its native color specification, And then in my actual program, I'm going to just index into that by just using an integer index. I'm going to say I want color 19 or something. And that was a thing back when we were, as I say, when we were building Wolfram language, that was the standard way to do color on computer displays, was using these color maps. PostScript had started to define sort of absolute specifications of color, and I decided that that was the future, and that we would just have a specification of color that was based on these absolute RGB values and so on, rather than setting up a color map in your display device and then indexing into that. Now, many operating systems, notably, well, MS-DOS and then early Windows, also had this sort of color map idea very deeply burnt into them. And I remember the sort of horror of, well, I think they were called paintbrushes, maybe they still are, in the Microsoft world. And the horror was kind of, we've got lots of colors on the screen, and it's like, you have run out of brushes. What do you mean you've run out of brushes? I don't see a paintbrush anywhere around. This is a computer type thing. But that was a thing because of this notion of color maps and a limited number of sort of indexed colors. It's still useful to have indexed colors. We have a color data function in Wolfram language, which provides a whole collection, sort of pre-built indexed colors. And actually, we have more sophistication coming on that in a future version. But that's kind of, it's a thing of modern times that one gets to specify sort of RGB, and that's implemented by actual sort of pixels on the screen being separately red, green, and blue. Now, previously with cathode ray tube displays, which is what there was until the 90s, the way that would work is that you would have dots on the screen, different phosphor dots for red, green, and blue, and you would have this shadow mask tube where the electron beam will be shining through that shadow mask, and it will be, at a certain moment, it will shine only onto the red dots of phosphor on the screen, so it will be making things red, another moment only green, another moment only blue, and as this happens very quickly and our eyes merge the images that come, in less than a 15th of a second, we're kind of merging those images together, we get kind of a that's how the colors were formed with cathode ray tubes. Now, sometime in the early 2000s, people started getting much more sophisticated about colors on displays, because one of the things that had happened was that it's like, well, that looks like green to me, and somebody else would say, no, it doesn't. It looks like blue to me because my computer display is set up a bit differently. And so then there was a notion of calibration of displays, and that's been sort of a thing of modern times. There's a lot of elaborate stuff about the calibration of color temperatures and all this kind of thing. I mean, color temperature is essentially, if you have an object and you heat it up, it first becomes red hot, then it becomes white hot, then it becomes blue hot. And that's a consequence of the spectrum, the black body spectrum of you're generating photons of different energies. You're generating a distribution of photons of different energies, and the color temperature is the effective temperature of that sort of black bar, black body, heated thing that corresponds to the color that you have. So, for example, I think what is it? 2,700 Kelvin? I don't know. I think they're different color temperatures. 6,500 Kelvin is I think the temperature of the photosphere of the sun, and so that's what the color of sunlight corresponds to that color temperature. And there's the whole question of whether your color display is sort of the colors as if they come from the sun versus the colors as if they come from a different temperature of object and so on, or as if illuminated by an incandescent bulb or by a fluorescent bulb and so on. So anyway, a few thoughts about the story of color in computer displays and in science. I mean, the science of color is a pretty elaborate thing, and it's for us humans, we have 3 color receptors. Dogs have 2, Mantis shrimps are supposed to have 15. Various kinds of fish have larger numbers of color receptors. The whole world of, what we have, a three-dimensional space of possible colors. The mantis shrimp presumably has a 15-dimensional space of possible colors, and it will have, if it could have a view of how color works with its sort of alien intelligence, it will be a very much more complicated view than the human view of color. And a lot of the sort of things we do, like hue, saturation, brightness, for the mantis shrimp, that won't quite cut it. It'll have to have a more complicated sort of polar coordinate parameterization of its 15-dimensional color space. But as I often say when we're developing Wolfram language and we're worrying about kind of, well, what if we were dealing with the vision system of the mantis shrimp? It's like, for the time being, it's only human customers. Well, actually, that isn't even true anymore, because they're also AI customers. And how the AIs will perceive things and what sort of color space will be relevant to the AI is an interesting question. Right now, the cameras that are connected to our, potential robots or other kinds of AI devices, those are still human compatible cameras with RGB as the color space. But you can also have hyperspectral cameras where, like the mantis shrimp, you're sampling many more wavelengths than just the red, green, and blue wavelength bands. And that's something, for example, for satellites doing remote sensing of the Earth, that's a common thing to do hyperspectral imaging. There also are applications like, is that piece of fruit ripe or not, or is it rotten? That's something you can tell with hyperspectral imaging more easily than you can tell by just looking at it with our eyes, seeing only the colors that we can see. So I suppose an interesting point is that, as the AIs get to have their own eyes, so to speak, independent of sort of things built for human eyes, one can imagine a world in which there is sort of a description of color that is the AI's hyperspectral description of color that goes beyond what we humans have so far used. Anyway, a few thoughts about that. Let's see. Helgo asks, what do you think about the Library of Babel? Do you think that all that could ever have been written has already been written in that library and we just have to find it? Well, that's a complicated question, maybe not for this live stream, but in the idea of the Ruliad, this thing that I think is sort of the basis of all reality, is this thing that is kind of the entangled limit of all possible computations. And in a sense, the Ruliad has in it everything that has happened and can happen. But the thing is that as observers of the Ruliad, we can only move through it at a certain rate. It has all this computation in it, but we, as computationally bounded observers, can only go through a tiny piece of it. And so, in a sense, it's like a Library of Babel where everything is written, but we only get to live in a tiny part of that library. So the fact that in principle there is a big library there is really a matter of sort of theoretical fact. It's not something that has practical significance for us, because we are sort of limited by having to move through it at that slow rate. So some questions here I see about my parents, because I just did a tweet today. Today would have been my father's 100th birthday. So I guess there are questions here about my father's history. I can tell it to you. I don't know how interesting it is, but well, my father was born in 1925, as you can tell from the fact that it's 100 years. He was born in Germany. His father was German. His mother was English. Well, his father was born. I was just looking this up recently. Was born in 1877. So really a ridiculously long time ago, by my standards, at least. I mean, it's always funny how time works in that regard, because it's like, I happened to start my career pretty young. I'm now kind of ancient. I knew a lot of people who were well known in science and technology back when I was young. And it's funny because those people, when their names come up, or, so-and-so's theorem, or so-and-so was the CEO of this company, it's like I immediately have a personal vision of that person. and it's like, oh yeah, I knew that person, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And younger people are like, that's so weird. I mean, those are just names in history to them. And I realized that people who were, around the beginning of the 20th century, for example, are for me just names in history. But it wasn't many generations ago that these were, that this, it isn't many generations. It's always surprising how few generations it is going back to things which feel like they're just moments in ancient history, not with any personal connection. But anyway, my father's father was born 1877, I believe, and ended up being quite academic. He actually got a PhD in veterinary science at University, gosh, in Switzerland, and Bern, I think. Was it Geneva? Forgotten. Um, the Anyway, I found his thesis recently. It's about the thymus gland of the cow, and I think he got it around, when was it? It must have been around 1900 or very very early uh, very soon after 1900. Um, and uh, Although it has pictures of kind of electrophysiology of the cardiograms of cows and things in it. But anyway, he was kind of academically inclined towards veterinary science. He then went, and I don't really know the dynamics of this, wound up as just kind of, in some sense, a country vet in Bochum, Germany. Maybe, in those days, it was perhaps, I'm sure being a veterinarian was a more, uh, a kind of perhaps not that it's an insignificant profession today, but I think it might have been the concept of going and like getting a PhD and so on, and it might have been more the obvious thing to do to go to a mid-sized town and be kind of the main town vet type thing. It's said, I mean, my grandfather died when I was pretty young, but it's as a matter of family lore, it's claimed that he was always more communicative with animals than with people, and he would walk down the street and he would kind of tip his hat at every horse that he went by, but not necessarily at the people. But in any case, the he uh, um, he ended up marrying a British woman who came from a fairly um, I don't know, a fairly well-to-do family. Um, and she was a concert pianist who uh, I don't know that much about her. Unfortunately, she died in childbirth, having my father. So she died back in 1925, and that was a thing in those days, not so uncommon at that time. And despite sort of medical, having reasonably sort of access to sophisticated medical, at least veterinary medicine, uh, that wasn't that still happened. Um, I have to say the in the sort of area of medical diagnosis and prognosis, I'm I'm remembering that my my grandfather, when he was, I guess he must have been in medical school before he was in veterinary school or something, but at the age of 20, he was told, you have some heart issue, you're not going to live past the age of 25 or something. He actually lived until his late 80s. So one of those medical things of the time, even that didn't work out. Actually, my grandfather was served in World War One as a veterinarian. Um, it is said, and again, piece of family lore, that the only shooting he ever did was in hunting expeditions, and that he was that was. But in any case, uh, he was um, uh, associated with some cavalry regiment in World War One. Well, my father was by 1933 things were kind of well, that I guess the family was Jewish, and by 1933 things were looking a little bit difficult in Germany, and so my father ended up starting to go to school in England, um, and indeed went to school in England. I think bounced back to Germany for vacations for a while. My and then uh, my father kind of went through sort of fairly good schools in England, and then I don't really know why he never went to college. I think it was basically because World War II started, and I just recently I was going through trying to find photographs for this tweet, and I have a lot of archive material, and I found this letter that my father wrote in 1942 to the Royal Air Force saying he wanted to join up to be a pilot, and kind of arguing why he shouldn't be considered to have too much kind of German connection to be a pilot. Uh, for some reason, I don't know, they turned him down, which is probably just as well because the life expectancy of pilots at that time was pretty low, and I certainly wouldn't be here. It would be very improbable that I would be here had he been accepted for that. But in any case, uh, he spent the war mostly working, I think, in munitions factory in England, and he was, and then um, ended up uh, being after the war somehow got involved with the then high-tech business of textile import-export. It's always funny that, today we think of software as being very, high-tech and so on. Back in 1945, kind of the idea of having an import-export company that would kind of try and, buy things from one part of the world, sell things to another part of the world, that was kind of the complicated thing of the time. And textiles were kind of a big kind of category of the time. And in any case, my father got hired, I guess, by a company that had been started by a chap who'd come out of the Navy in World War II, and doing textile importing and exporting. And I have to say, when I was a kid, the sort of the machinery of doing importing and exporting was always very strange, because it was, like I managed to collect lots of stamps from all over the world because they were getting all this stuff from all these different countries where they were buying, pieces of wool from this place and pieces of cotton from that place and so on. And I do, and they, at the time there were the sort of the high-tech communication mechanism was a telex machine, which is a 5-hole paper tape thing where you would kind of dial on these phone lines, and then you would send through this message saying, yes, we want to buy X number of cartons of this kind of yarn and so on. In any case, my father, by the 1960s, he had been the person who started the company that he worked for, had retired, and basically sold it to my father and one partner, and then that partner dropped out, and then my father ended up running, basically a textile import-export company for, I don't know, more than 50 years. And I was not an industry that I would know much about. I always thought it was very peculiar that, well, in the difficulties of doing international trade were quite high, because it was all these kind of, how do you trust this person and that person? And, you've got this whole chains of letters of credit and all those kinds of things. Kind of as a hobby, my father had always done writing, and ended up in late 1960s, started publishing novels to some critical acclaim. I'm not sure not to great commercial success. But and I think his first novel, at least, was very much about the story of people and families, and the result of World War II on families and so on. And I think I have to say I've not been a great student of my father's writings, and it's kind of a bad. But I don't know whether my children have read things I've written, but it somehow seems like a feature of. I don't know whether children reading their parents' material is it should be a thing, but perhaps it isn't as much as it should be. And then, well, the um, actually, I'm sort of amused. I know one of my father's books had featured some kind of magnate of some sort who had a big plastic dinosaur in their in their house. And I'm super amused that a friend of mine has a cast of a dinosaur, I think the same type of tyrannosaur in their house. So it's kind of a funny thing, quite independently, fact kind of trails fiction in a case like that. In any case, I think that's a little bit um, on on my father. And so I see a question from Kogar here. How far back can you trace your family history? I haven't gone to a huge amount of effort to do this, and I know some other people in my kind of family tree have gone a bit further. I think certainly into the 1700s, maybe a little bit further than that, and had a few slightly distinguished folk, mostly in Germany-ish. I guess there are other ones in England. The name Wolfram has well, I know there was a Saint Wolfram in the 7th century AD who was in France. I think he was a rather undistinguished saint. And actually, charmingly enough, one of the only kind of features for that saint was there is a church in Lincolnshire in England. There's a Church of St. Wolfram. Sometimes it's spelt with a W-U rather than W-O, but a Church of St. Wolfram. And the only notable thing that I know about that church is it's been around a long time. And Isaac Newton went to elementary school at that church. So it's just sort of a charming little ultra footnote to history, so to speak. But and then there I don't know. Well, let's see. Yeah, I think I'm not sure there are some other pieces, various pieces of the family fragmented to different parts of the world, largely as a result of the run up to World War II and so on. But Janice is asking, have I done one of those DNA tests to map my genetic history? Of course I have. I do all of those kinds of things. And yes, I get all those messages saying, you have some third cousins who've shown up on somewhere. I have to say, I have not tracked those down very, very carefully. But yes, I used to think, yeah, so I can pretty well localize my genetic ancestry, so to speak. Ollie asks, well, okay, I should, if you really want to know about my parents, I should also say something about my mother. My mother was her main thing was she was a philosophy professor in Oxford, and she let's see her background. Her mother came from Austria, and mother went to study in Berlin, where she met a medical researcher, and they got married, and they had my mother. That was in 1931, and they subsequently got divorced, but they both independently came to England. My mother's mother had gotten involved with psychoanalysis, and I guess worked with Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. And my mother's mother was particularly involved with child psychoanalysis. Not necessarily the parent you want to have is the psychoanalyst parent, so to speak. And my mother's mother, whose name was Kate Friedlander, she kind of wrote a book at some point about the psychoanalytical treatment of juvenile delinquency. I think that book is still in print. And the question was always which of the case histories was actually a case history of my mother that was in the book of sort of strange case histories of children and so on. But my mother's mother, as I say, came to England. Oh, I don't know exactly when. Sometime I don't actually know. I know my mother's stepfather was still traveling back and forth to Germany, even in 1939, and he was well, in Germany he'd been involved with infectious diseases. In England, he became a radiologist, and I found his passport recently, and there are still stamps from going back and forth between Germany and England in 1939, which is sort of a bit surprising. But in any case, the uh, my my mother's mother came to England, and that must have been by, oh gosh, oh yeah, in fact, I know when it was. It was, no, she must have come to England the by 1934 actually. So I'm wrong. It was earlier. So um, and then sort of requalified in medicine in England, and then did child psychoanalysis, and I guess was involved with what used to be called child guidance clinics or something, and kind of starting these kind of social services things. My mother's mother died pretty young. I think she died in 1948. And she was I would say, quite notable character in her time. And I found actually recently a curious piece of film that was from a psychoanalytical conference must have been 1946, 1947, something like that. And there's just a little snap of film where my mother's mother is walking out of this conference talking to Margaret Mead, of all people. But I also know that in another sort of small world thing, my mother's mother happened to know a chap called Lionel Penrose, who was a geneticist, who is Roger Penrose's father. Roger Penrose being a physicist who I've known for a long time. In any case, so my mother ended up going to Oxford for college and studied, I guess, PPE, which is their sort of standard philosophy, politics, and economics, and then kind of ended up, well, doing the PhD in those days, even though PhD stands for, Doctor of Philosophy, or even in Oxford, it's DPhil, Doctor of Philosophy. You couldn't get a PhD in philosophy at that time. It was kind of viewed, at least in Oxford, it was kind of like philosophy as a meta subject, and there isn't the kind of raw material in philosophy itself to be something you could get a PhD in. So my mother ended up getting a PhD in anthropology, and she studied she ended up studying kind of in the sort of school of philosophy of anthropology of structuralism, and this chap Claude Lévi-Strauss in France was kind of the founder of that. And my mother studied with, I guess, a student of Claude Lévi-Strauss's, and then her thesis was about marriage prohibitions in England, and she ended up studying, these questions about, according to sort of the rules, this had been a thing that had been a lot studied for indigenous peoples in lots of places. Are there prohibitions against marrying your first cousin, your second cousin, your deceased whatevers? In England, one of the big controversies was the deceased wife's sister controversy. Should you be allowed to marry your deceased wife's sister? And I'm not sure where it came down in the end. But my mother kind of studied, instead of doing field work in some obscure island, she was doing field work in England, studying, going through lots of the kind of the kind of raw material from legal cases and other things, studying that. She ended up writing a book about it many years later, actually, about kinship rules in England and so on. And I know she later on she got she was going through in the archives at the House of Lords, going through all of the divorce cases, because in those days you had to have kind of an act of parliament, and in the 1800s to get a divorce it was an act of parliament, so it was sort of all recorded. And she was noted that the rate of divorce for some period of time had actually increased exponentially over the course of a couple of centuries. But in any case, she after doing her PhD in anthropology, she'd also worked a bunch in philosophy. She particularly worked with a chap called Peter Strawson, who was a linguistic philosophy person in the Oxford tradition. There were a bunch of linguistic philosophers as kind of philosophy thinking about thinking as something sort of dependent on language, so to speak. And there was a very different tradition in Cambridge that was around Wittgenstein and people like that. The Oxford crowd all thought that was a terrible tradition and they didn't have anything useful to say. And but at the time it was sort of a golden age for linguistic philosophy in Oxford, and there were a lot of discussion about things like, is it meaningful to say this statement is true, or should you just say this statement? If you say it is raining today, that's saying something, or it is raining today is true. Is that saying something different from just saying it is raining today? And they were fond of kind of questions like the statement, the King of France is bald. Well, there is no King of France. So what is the truth value of the statement, the King of France is bald? Well, my mother studied a bunch of philosophical logic around those kinds of things, actually wrote a textbook of philosophical logic that still seems to be in pretty good circulation these days. That's full of discussions of things like that. When I was a kid, I kind of always took the point of view that, philosophy is not a serious subject because you're still arguing about things that you were arguing about 2,000 years ago. I think there was a kind of naive point of view about it, but I was pretty firm on the fact when I was a kid that if there was one thing I would never do when I was grown up, it's do philosophy. And of course, that has turned out not to be quite correct as it's happened. I remember actually, this must have been 1980. I was talking about AI, and my mother was like, well, if you build one of those things, I really want to do experiments on it. Think of all those philosophical experiments you could do on such a thing, which I, at the time, was like, that can't be serious. But as it turns out, you probably can do very interesting philosophical experiments on AIs at, nowadays. Anyway, what else to say about my parents? I think my mother, did quite a lot of academic work, and she also took teaching very seriously. And their PPE in Oxford, which is what she taught, is something that has a whole stream of politicians and things that have gone through it. And so she got to teach lots of those kinds of people who went off to do all kinds of interesting, sometimes wonderful, sometimes not so wonderful things. And my mother would get invited to these various sorts of strange events at various embassies and things for various people that she had taught. And I think in those days, and again, I used to kind of make fun of this, but if you were giving a philosophy lecture, it was kind of like you would write out every word because it was all very tight. And I was like, you can't seriously do that. And so now I suppose I'm channeling the not doing that in doing these kinds of live streams and such like. Let's see. I hear from people, actually, with respect to my mother, I just heard from somebody a week or two ago. One of the adventures my mother had, this was in the early 1960s, was Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist I mentioned earlier, somehow picked my mother as his preferred translator of a book of his from French into English. It was a book called La Pensée Sauvage, which in French either means the wild mind or the wild pansy flower. And anyway, my mother translated this book, and there ensued a whole elaborate, complicated correspondence in which Levi-Strauss hated various aspects of the translation and was arguing in particular about the title of the book. In the French edition, the cover of the book has a picture of a flower on it. And he really wanted it to be called in English, The Wild Pansy. As it turns out, it ended up being called The Savage Mind, which also wasn't a great name for it because it was all about how the savages aren't really just savages. You know, they have societies kind of just like ours type thing. So it was kind of a weird name for it. But it all became quite a complicated cause with all kinds of letters to the editor in the anthropology journals and so on. Eventually, my mother took her name off the translation, but it was known she'd been responsible for it. And I actually found, just as I was looking for these things a couple of weeks ago, my mother mentioning that the correspondence that she'd had with Claude Lévi-Strauss was thicker than the translation. So the question is, where is that correspondence? Because I have all of these boxes of stuff, and I've been slowly getting them scanned and going through them. Somewhere there is this cache of material between exchange of letters between Lévi-Strauss and my mother that I get asked about probably about once a year by people doing history of anthropology. And I've been frustrated in having to say I don't know where they are, but I'm pretty sure they're in some box that I have somewhere. Actually, the person who contacted me recently, who's writing a book about some related history, said that the Lévi-Strauss side of that correspondence is in an archive in Paris, although a rather tightly controlled archive. So perhaps that's a thing I might find. Let's see, Des comments, I've noticed a lot of women in philosophy in Oxford and Cambridge in the pre-war period when prominent American universities didn't allow women at all. Yeah, I don't know. American philosophy kind of, well, I don't know the full history. I certainly know that some of the prominent American philosophers, like Quine, for example, who I met once, my mother met him many times. He was a linguistic philosopher at Harvard, and he was kind of, well, I think he was sort of, really emerging at the beginning of the 1950s. I'm not sure how much there was a lot before then. Maybe I'm being unfair. I mean, there were people like Charles Sanders Peirce, who were kind of American philosophers, but he was an amateur. I mean, his son was a well-known professor of mathematics at Harvard who was very much involved in creating linear algebra. But Charles Sanders Peirce himself, I think this was around 1900, his day job was working for the Coast Guard. But he wrote many books about philosophy and pragmatics and all this kind of thing. There were people who were doing things like logic and so on, like Henry Scheffer, for example. But I think maybe I'm being unfair, but I think that my impression is that American philosophy kind of got launched on the sort of more logic side by the influx of folks from Poland and Germany in the 1930s, and then sort of ramped up even more in the 1960s with what used to be called the brain drain from England of people who had been professors in Oxford and Cambridge and so on, coming to greener pastures in the US. Certainly in England, in Oxford, one of the things that really drove kind of women in academia in Oxford was that there were women's colleges. And there were sort of distinct men's colleges and women's colleges. And the women's colleges, a bunch of them were founded in the late 1800s. And, they had women students and women professors. And that was a thing. And some fraction of the university was that way. And I think that was true in Cambridge as well. For some reason, I think there were more women's colleges in Oxford than in Cambridge, but I'm not sure if that's right. And And yes, there were a bunch of women in philosophy at that time. I certainly met a bunch of them because my mother pretty much knew all of them. It was not a large circle of people. And oh gosh, what's the name of the person? The person who invented the trolley problem, the ethics trolley problem, Philippa Foot, yes, was somebody my mother knew fairly well. And there was also there were many philosophers. Another one, Elizabeth Anscombe, was another person who was notable because she was a big Wittgenstein fan and uh, somehow involved with that whole thing. I don't know all of these details, but it's funny because when you're a kid, you meet these white-haired people. It's hard to be that interested in it, really. Although I have to say there were many times when I was kind of trailing along with my mother to some aged 5 or 8 or something like this to some event or another, and there would be a bunch of white-haired adults there, and I'd be the only kid in the room, and one of the white-haired adults would come over and start chatting with me, and usually go on chatting with me for a while. And I realize now that it's often more fun. Well, I was probably a slightly interesting kid to chat with. Certainly, I remember one lovely incident. I must have been, I don't know, 6 or something, maybe a little older, I'm not sure, chatting with some white-haired chap for some long period of time. And person's walking away and sort of mumbling to themselves, one day that child will be a philosopher, but it may take a while, which turned out to be amusingly prophetic in some sense. Unfortunately, I don't know who that was. It's probably quite possibly some quite famous Oxford philosopher of the time. But it was a funny thing to have that perspective on. I didn't know the names of these people at the time. I didn't know about the history of philosophy at all. I would know these people's kids often, and the rambunctious kids of the person who was the great scholar of Frege, for example. Except I didn't know they were the great scholar of Frege until 30 years later or something. So it's always funny to have that perspective. It's also for me, as I try and study the history of philosophy, it is strange when it's like, oh yes, I've heard that name. I remember that person's kid, whatever else. It's a strange thing, and it's particularly happens because it was a very concentrated time in the history of philosophy. This period from 1940s to the probably 1970s was kind of an intense period of linguistic philosophy in Oxford. All right, I should probably, let's see. What other? Well, VM asks, oh, there's a question from Ollie. Did your parents encourage your interest in physics, or were they hoping you would pursue a different field? My parents didn't really know what to think children would do. And I have to say, I always complained about my parents, as children are wont to do. But I have a younger brother, but my younger brother is 10 and a half years younger than me. So I was an effective only child for a decade with parents who had, studied well, my father had been interested in kind of psychoanalysis and things like this. In fact, the way he met my mother was because of sort of a person who had known my mother's mother, and he had been asking, who he knew, he'd been asking, well, about my mother's mother. The person said, well, she died, but she had a kid. Maybe you should meet the kid, because they also knew my mother, and so that's how they met. The the fact that my parents had sort of been, my father at least had been interested in kind of had read the works of Freud and Jung and all these people, and was interested in those kinds of things, and my mother kind of had this history with the psychoanalysts, and certainly knew a bunch of the kind of particularly German emigres, psychoanalysts who'd come to England, a funny bunch, I have to say. I met them, many of them when I was a kid, and they were always asking me the strangest questions. But and had kind of the anyway, uh, so my parents sort of had a theoretical knowledge of children, but no practical knowledge of children. So whatever I did was kind of like, insofar as it didn't follow the theoretical knowledge of children, it was like mysterious. And so I really got to be a pretty independent child. And I got interested well, I was interested in science, I suppose, from a super young age, because I was sort of interested in the future. Maybe I've always been an optimist. My parents claim that I was one of these children who learnt the word yes before they learnt the word no, which perhaps is a sign of something. But in any case, the thing that I ended up sort of teaching myself to read from sort of popular science books with captions and such like. And I suppose my parents, I would say, I got very interested in space and things like this. And my parents were like, okay, I don't know anything about that. And my, I suppose so they really knew, I mean, I guess, yeah, perhaps it's one of these things where children explore areas that their parents know little about. Perhaps that's the dynamic, but that's sort of what happened. And I really didn't have much, uh, I wouldn't have said my parents particularly encouraged, discouraged, or anything. I did things I did because I wanted to do them. And uh, I think I was a bit unparented, which perhaps is a good thing, perhaps is a bad thing. But I was not I was both a a very unwild kid, but also a very perhaps non-standard kid, because I would go off, and by the time I was like 11 or so years old, I would go off and just spend a bunch of time trying to figure out stuff in science and write things. And I wrote lots of stuff, which finally I put on the web a few years ago. It's deciding it was, with the disclaimer, I wrote this when I was 12 years old. So I don't, can't completely vouch for it today. But I was kind of an independently go off and do my thing kind of kid. And I suppose that's so I can't really say. I mean, my mother and her philosophical friends, whenever, when one would talk about sort of science, which I didn't do very often, there would often be but how could you possibly know that kind of question about some thing about the world? And I have to say that's always a good question when you hear, a medical study has shown that whatever, the how could you possibly know that is often a good question. What actually went into figuring that out? So I was exposed to that quite a lot, and I suppose my mother probably, I think when I was pretty young, she sort of would kind of try out arguments from lectures she was going to give and so on me, which and I was usually, somewhat. It's like, well, isn't it obvious that blah blah blah? I don't know whether it was obvious or not, but it seemed to be something that was sort of interesting. I do remember few times talking to friends of my mother's who were sort of philosophers of science, philosophers of physics, and so on. There's one time in particular I remember, I must have been maybe 12 years old or something. I was talking to a woman who was a philosopher of time, and I was talking about relativistic time dilation, all these kinds of things, and she was saying, "Well, how do you know that just because you can argue this mathematically. How do you know that when it comes to an actual human in an actual spacecraft, so to speak, that they will experience time in that way as opposed to another way. And I was like, but that's kind of just what the math says. And so I was a bit embarrassed many years later to realize that it isn't quite as simple as that. I mean, famously, the GPS satellites that are going fast and undergo time dilation, their clocks are specifically corrected for that to make it easier for GPS receivers to operate. So in the mind of the GPS satellite, there isn't time dilation in the same sense. And when you ask about the rat that's being sent to Alpha Centauri or something on the very fast rocket, is it in fact obvious that it will experience time in the same way that an idealized clock based on light signals will experience time? I don't think it's quite so obvious. So many years later, I'm sort of duly embarrassed at my complete dismissal of this particular person's kind of arguments about time, even though I have to say I would criticize these philosophers of science at the time for their lack of knowledge of science. I mean, it is probably not a good sign when the 12-year-old can definitely knows more about the technicalities of time dilation and so on than the philosopher of time. But I'm not sure that tradition. I think there's been more of a tradition of knowing the sort of scientific substance of these things in subsequent years. Okay, there's a comment from Des. My experience with people in elite philosophy programs is that they're often terrifyingly sharp. Was that your experience as well? I'm not sure what you mean by sharp. They were smart people. Yeah, it was kind of. I mean, I suppose I was spoiled because I was between the parents and the children of the Oxford philosophers. They were at the time a bright bunch. I would say that they particularly kind of kind of verbally quick with arguments and so on, and occasionally with witticism. Sometimes very British witticism. But yes, they were, I think sometimes the rhetoric got a bit ahead of the content, and people would spin a rhetorical tale that sounded really good, but when you started to take it apart, it would fall apart. I think that yeah, I mean, maybe I was spoiled in expecting kind of quickness in intellectual quickness from the philosophy crowd. It certainly was a place where people, the tradition of philosophy, different fields have different traditions. The tradition in philosophy is somebody reads a paper. That means they go and they give a talk, often reading from the verbatim thing they've written. They read a paper and then people discuss it, which means people immediately attack it and say that can't possibly be right because. And that's been the tradition of philosophy probably for 2,000 years. And in a sense, it's a very healthy tradition. I mean, it's people have an expectation that the things they say will be contested. It's not rude that they're being contested. It's just the way that field works. In other fields, it would be totally rude and shocking that the person who, somebody reads one paper and then somebody else gives a reply to that paper. And if that reply was so-and-so has got it all wrong, is their first sentence. In some fields, that will be seen as a completely shocking and incredibly rude thing. In philosophy, at least, sort of Oxford philosophy at the time, it was not. It was just a kind of what one did. And one would argue one side, then one would argue the other side, and one would sort of expect that something useful would come out from that process. So that was a feature. I mean, I don't think I got to see the philosophers mostly in social settings, and mostly as a pretty young kid, and it was. I mean, I suspect that probably the training in thinking that I sort of implicitly got from random discussions with random philosophers was probably not bad. And I'm sort of a big believer these days in kind of foundational thinking about things. And I suppose after a 50-year gap or more, I'm kind of reverting a little bit to things that I probably absorbed in those days. Well, let's see, I should wrap up soon here. Let's see, maybe one or two other questions. David comments, isn't the word for tungsten in German Wolfram? Well, yes. And the symbol for tungsten in the periodic table is a W. I am told that in 1952, there were two elements up for grabs in terms of their name, tungsten and niobium. And tungsten was called tungsten in the US, and it was called wolfram in many other parts of the world. Niobium was called columbium in the US and niobium in other parts of the world. And I think in the International Union of Chemical Union, I think, there was this sort of agreement reached, I think in 1952, that Europe would get niobium and the US wouldn't get columbium, and the US would get tungsten and Europe wouldn't get wolfram as the name of an element. So it wasn't, it was not, so tungsten is called tungsten, but confusingly its symbol is W in the periodic table. No, it wasn't discovered by a person called Wolfram, it was discovered by a Swedish chap. It is something Wolfram, well, the ore of tungsten is a thing called wolframite, WO4, that is often mined along with aluminum. And I think the miners, I think maybe German miners, had started calling the thing that came out, the kind of frothy stuff that came out with aluminum, wolf froth. And that became wolfram and then wolfram as the name of this element. What the history of, and the history of my family name, I don't know exactly where it came from for my family, but I do know, as I mentioned earlier, that there was a Saint Wolfram in the 7th century AD. There was another person named Wolfram, a woman named something Wolfram, who lived in a village in England, actually, in the around 1000 AD. The village in England happened to be really close to where my parents had a house, which I thought was kind of funny when I found out about it many years later. But yes, the name for it's a funny thing that I get emails of people trying to, it's a very bizarre thing, of people trying to sell me tungsten, the material. And I guess that's because I have a company, we have a company called Wolfram Research, and it's kind of like, well, you must do a lot of stuff with tungsten then for people who are not native English speakers. And it's kind of a strange thing. I wouldn't have expected to get lots of kind of ads for tungsten wire made for, in this or that place. All right. Well, anyway, I see a lot of other interesting questions here, which I look forward to addressing another time. I see one from Paul here about the discovery of entropy. I have to say I wrote a really long thing about the history of the second law of thermodynamics, which talks about that, but I'm happy to chat about that here another time. Oh, I see a question here. Can I talk a bit about the history of Stephen Wolfram? Okay, well, maybe another time. Yeah, I see a bunch of questions here. Let's see if there are any that are related to things I've specifically talked about. Breck asks about my father growing up between England and Germany in pre-war years, and asked, did he write about a perspective on the war? Well, yes, he wrote these novels about, which I suppose are fictionalized accounts of kind of the war and the things around it and the kind of cultural dynamics of that. I have to say, my father was not one for for my father was very interested in people, and perhaps like me was interested in uh, the paths that people take, and was kind of kept track of people. I have to say one of his features was he got a newspaper. The first page he would turn to was always the obituary page. And I used to give him a hard time for that. But he's like, but these are stories of people and they're interesting. And I suppose I inherited a bit of that interest, but I don't think he was ever very interested in sort of more factual history. And I have to say, in uh, uh, I will say there are many pieces of kind of family lore which I've ended up at one time or another checking up on, and they usually aren't quite right. So, and that was um, okay. I'll tell you one amusing case, and then should wrap up here. Has to do with a bicycle. So my father's father had brought from Germany a bicycle that didn't have a chain, and it had some kind of other mechanism for transmitting things from the pedals to the. I think it's some. I don't know exactly how it works, but it's not a chain. Okay, so somehow my father's father lent his bicycle to somebody sometime in the 1950s, and somehow the bicycle upon was never returned and showed up in the London Science Museum, which is as being an interesting example of a bicycle that has some whole sort of different mechanism. And it's last time I was in the Science Museum, it's still on display there. But it was my my father was a bit annoyed that it was kind of the bicycle that had been lent to somebody wound up donated to the Science Museum with a gift of so and so, the person it had been lent to. But anyway, one of the things that he claimed was, well, if you look at that the bicycle, it has this weird attachment to the pedals. He said that was because his father had had kind of a gammy leg, and this had been to accommodate his kind of gammy leg. He got the gammy leg because another one of these, I don't know if it's true, family law type stories, because he was kicked by a horse at some point. He was a veterinarian, so that was an occupational hazard. But he had this pocket watch in his pocket that had kind of saved him from this horse's kick, but had somehow had still damaged his leg and so on. And I have the pocket watch, and the pocket watch does have a dent in it. So this may be evidence of the veracity of that story. In any case, my father claimed this about this bicycle. The curators at the Science Museum said, well, actually, no, there are other bicycles of the time that had similar sort of attachments on them. So I've never really gone to check on this in more detail. But that's one of these. It's hard to know what was actually true in that particular story. So I don't think not necessarily the greatest source of factual information on those kinds of things. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. Some unexpected topics today, but interesting for me to try and recall these things, and hope it was of interest to you guys. And I look forward to doing this another time. And bye for now.